Welcome to Shepherd's Table, and thank you for joining us today. I am Julie Lane, and I am your host for today's episode. I'd like to welcome our three pastors today. We have Pastor Shane from St. Peter, Pastor Patrick from Heights Baptist, and Pastor Roland from Victory Lutheran. So welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Julie. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you. We are very excited today to talk about a topic that has been very prevalent right now going on, how churches should respond to Alberta Separation. I believe we've all been talking about this, and I'm sure we've had it come up in our congregations. So I'd like to hear from you guys. How do you think churches should respond? Pastor, we'll go with you.
Well, that is a very interesting topic. Anytime something controversial like this comes up, it is the duty of the pastor, I think, to figure out a way to discuss this in a couple of different ways. One, to make sure that our own opinions don't necessarily dominate the conversation. And two, to recognize that even though we may feel strongly one way or the other, that everyone does have an opinion and usually are basing that on something valid or something deeply held, such as patriotism versus freedom. You know, all of these things that are floating through people's heads, and they have different ways of processing that, I guess, is the way to talk about it. Yeah.
I think that especially with a topic like this, it's not just about separation.
Yeah.
It is all of the other underlying issues. And so many people bring different things.
Yeah.
So you have what the federal government is doing with Bill C-9, abortion, all of these different things. It's not necessarily just about freedom. So
right.
How do you bring all of that together?
Well, again, the Lutheran tradition, from dating way back, we've always we've always been connected to the law of the land in a way. So that only works, though, if the law of the land actually reflects what we know to be what we would call Christian values or Christian morality, I guess is the right way to put it. And so we have to look at this, or at least from a Lutheran point of view, we have to look at this from a couple of different angles, any of these topics. Who does this affect? What is the price that we pay if we are going to talk about this openly, say in a circle, in a group of people like we are today, or even in our church basement or something like that? We generally, as Lutherans, pastors, don't talk much about these topics directly from the pulpit.
Can I ask why?
In our view, the pulpit is for preaching the gospel, not for revealing political views or even discussing political views. So if for example, if we were to talk about, if somebody was to come to me and say, hey, how come you don't talk about abortion from the pulpit? It's not that I don't have an opinion on abortion or the church doesn't. It's just, how about we instead talk about the underlying precepts that we have as Christians? For instance, what is the baseline? Well, right in the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill. So how do you apply things like abortion or euthanasia, what we call MAID, or suicide, or murder, or any of the things that fall under the homicide label? How does that apply to this baseline, thou shalt not kill, or thou shalt not murder, however you read that?
So you mentioned that people ask why you don't address those subjects. Is it your congregation, or is it other people who are
usually other people? I think Lutherans who have been congregation members for particularly their whole lives, or even a few years, understand that it's not typical for a Lutheran pastor to directly discuss a political topic from the pulpit. Now, in a Bible study or something like that, I might be more direct about, how we should think about that. For example, if abortion comes up, I would say, well, okay, so in the commandments, thou shalt not kill. How do you then reconcile this particular topic to this?
Okay.
And then we have that discussion. And again, it's not me inserting my own particular viewpoint into that. It's me taking a very, very Christian or very, very biblical subject and going, okay, this is the baseline. How do you, if you are somebody who's in favor of abortion, how do you reconcile this with this? Okay. That's more how I would handle it as a leader in the church. Now again, it's not as if I don't give my opinion at times, but I also have to be careful on politics because I'm also a military chaplain.
Yeah.
And when you are any military member, one of the first things they say to you is, now that you've sworn an oath to the king, you officially have no opinion.
That would be difficult because you've already sworn your allegiance to a different king.
Absolutely, yes, that's right. However, it depends on the context too, where I can, for example, as a military chaplain, somebody comes into my office, I can't proselytize.
Okay.
Right? And that's just a condition of being a chaplain in the military. Now, if they were to ask me, what is it that gives you hope? Then I'm allowed to do that. But I can't just come in and thump somebody with a Bible and,
I don't think that's an approach for anyone.
Yeah, that's right.
Let's be real here.
Yeah,
Hitting them with the
absolutely.
Bible, it's not going to come in through that
Yeah,
way.
no, exactly. It's a waste of time anyway.
Yeah.
But you know what I'm saying. There's that.
The truth shines through.
Absolutely. So I believe adhering to military rules like that, I can do a far greater good by, kind of sticking to that as much as I can.
Okay.
Right.
All right, Patrick, how about you? Same question.
Well, I'm not even sure what the original question was anymore. I didn't know if Shane was going to give us a turn to talk, but
Yeah, I went down some rabbit holes.
Yeah.
It was going to happen. You guys were aware.
Well, let me just talk really even about, how could we maybe understand Alberta separation from a biblical point of view? And why is it that some Christians feel strongly about Alberta separation? Now, we look at the book of Acts, and there was a great persecution against the believers in the city of Jerusalem, and so they dispersed from Jerusalem into Judea and Samaria and to other places. And so for the last 2,000 years, we've seen this history of Christians fleeing persecution. And you've already mentioned, Julie, for example, Bill C-9, the Liberal government's attempt to ban certain parts of the Bible. We've seen previously under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau their conversion therapy ban, where, converting someone or calling a person living a homosexual or transgender lifestyle to repent is a criminal offense punishable by 5 years in prison. So the Liberal government has been criminalizing the preaching of the gospel, calling people to repentance, quoting certain parts of the Bible. And so this government, and I have no problem saying it, is an antichrist government. It is anti-Christian. They are in the business of persecuting Christians. We saw this during COVID. We've seen it since. The DEI practices, the speech codes, and all these sorts of things. And so from a biblical point of view, and again from church history, we see Christians for the past 2,000 years have fled persecution. And so in the minds of some Christians in Alberta, this is how they flee the persecution coming from the Liberal government in Ottawa. It's not by physically leaving Canada, it's by having Alberta leave Canada and become a separate country. So people understand, I think, Alberta separation in that light. And think too about the history of the Kingdom of Israel. After the death of King Solomon, the kingdom divided, the 10 tribes to the north and the 2 tribes to the south. And absolutely there was corrupt, sinful leadership in both kingdoms. But by and large, the northern kingdom pursued a much more sinful path and was judged more severely by God. And I think that Christians think that if Alberta separates from Canada, it's not that Alberta is going to be a perfectly holy place, but that it will not follow the same destructive, sinful path to the extent that the rest of Canada will. So I think, in the minds of a lot of Christians that support Alberta independence, that's their thinking. It's really about fleeing persecution coming from Ottawa.
And separating ourselves from evil. And I think that a lot of the things that are going on in the federal government could be described as...
We've mentioned some of those. Again, the obsession with abortion, transgenderism, homosexuality, the euthanasia, the MAID, all of these sorts of things. These are reasons to flee, and the expansion of MAID is really the latest thing. And, I think Christians in Canada, some Christians in Canada, fled the country during COVID because some of the persecution against pastors and churches. So I think there are legitimate concerns that people have regarding the direction Canada is headed.
Are you guys aware of in the Liberal conference when they were talking about charging people and fining people for leaving Canada, like $1 million? I can't remember the exact total.
$500,000.
Yeah, that's what it was, $500,000. And that's not feasible. So when we talk about, I think that comes into play from people I've talked to, is when you're talking about separation, because it could be a point where it's not even legal for us to leave or possible for us to leave physically. Yeah, that's a possibility. All right, Pastor Roland, you're up next.
Yeah, I think it's very important that the divisions that we find in the world don't become divisions in the church. The church that I have the privilege of serving has a wide range of opinions. as many churches do, right? You'll find people on every end of the spectrum and everything in between. And I think it's very important that those political divisions don't become things that start dividing the church from one another. And a lot of this happens when we tend to couch political values in theological language. Because, so often what everyone likes to do is, conveniently, Jesus always agrees with my political opinions. Well, isn't that nice, right? Isn't that good of Jesus to always agree with whatever you've determined to be the correct political outcome? The other thing that I always like to warn people against is getting too caught up in the politics of the day. Today it's this issue, tomorrow it'll be something else. And I always point to this example because I think it's a powerful one. In the European church, the overwhelming amount of clergymen and bishops and leaders in the church supported the monarchies against the people that wanted republics and democracies. And they did so because they said, well, in the Bible, we see God sets up a monarchy, not a democracy, right?
Just read that in my devotions, and God regretted putting Saul as king.
Sure,
so
yeah, absolutely.
There was that.
Well, he regretted it because he wanted to be their king, right? Yeah. And so it was Israel's disobedience that actually got them a king, ironically enough, rather than anything else. But the point being, the church endangers herself when she attaches herself too much to an earthly political system or ideology. We transcend these things. As you had mentioned earlier, we already have a king, right? And nobody elected him, who put you in charge, Jesus, and yet here he is, right? He's been made king by the Father, and one day he will return, take up his throne, make all things new. And so keeping our eye on the eschatological vision and recognizing the kingship of Christ, I think, is the primary directive of a church. Now, churches happen to be in certain times and in certain places, right? All of our churches exist here in Medicine Hat, and one of the hot button topics, absolutely, because I've heard 1,000 times in my office about this opinion and that opinion and everything about this Alberta independence. But I think the thing that I like to really highlight to people is your Christianity, your salvation is not contingent on your voting pattern. To vote in favor of independence does not send you to hell. To vote against independence does not send you to hell. Now, we may have very reasonable, as I think we already are, conversations about how a Christian may align based on that and say, we can have debates over what a biblically informed worldview would align themselves with. But I think it's very important that we don't make, salvation and someone's membership in the church and someone's faith in Christ contingent on what they do at the ballot box.
And I think that the real issue is that some of these issues, so not separation in general, but a lot of these other issues that are the underlying, like your abortion, the attacks on Christianity, well, those are considered political. I would argue that they're not actually political. You look at before, and the church keeps getting accused of going too far into politics. You're not allowed to talk about politics. But I would argue that the government has actually gone in too much into religious, and that's why we have to push back. Let's go back over here to Pastor James. How do you feel about that?
Well, the idea that there's a separation of church and state, which has been, especially in the U.S., discussed for as long as it's been a country, was not actually, as many people today are gaslit into believing, it was not so that the government would be free from church influence. It was exactly the opposite. It was to keep the government out of church affairs. Yeah. And actually, it's not even really discussed in the Constitution. It's not a constitutional rule that there's a separation of church and state. It has become that way over time. I don't think it's a bad thing at all because, as I said, I would prefer to keep government out of church affairs myself. But I don't think there's anything wrong, as you said, and again, this gets complicated, with church having some influence on how things are done. I have no problem with Christians taking political office, for instance, and applying their
Christian. It's necessary.
And it is necessary. Absolutely, it is, and applying there are moral chops to that, right? Where they can sit down and have a discussion in a political setting about abortion or those kinds of issues and come to it from a Christian point of view, which, as you said, C9 and some of these other things are trying to eliminate that.
Yeah.
Because if they can eliminate that, they have no opposition, which is, and again, that's one of the reasons Jesus is so hated and has been hated by the Pharisees on up until the current day. He's a threat to power and influence, and always has been. Right? As soon as a communist government sets up, the first thing they do is get rid of all the churches. Why? Because that's the only thing that stands between them and ultimate power.
Churches and families.
But certainly families, but I see that as an extension of the church, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, you bet.
All right, Patrick.
Well, I'd like to actually maybe push back a bit on something Roland said, and I agree with him. When we talk about Alberta independence, to me, it's not a black or white issue. I talked before about how Christians, this is kind of the case, biblically speaking, for Alberta separation, persecution, and whatnot. But also, recently I was at an event where Stockwell Day, a Christian man, former politician, or he might call himself a recovering politician, spoke, and he argued against Alberta separation, saying that this would create a situation where there would be endless lawsuits, that it would create an environment of economic instability that would scare away investment. Great, there's that argument to be made, absolutely. So I agree. I mean, I don't think the church should divide over the issue of Alberta separation. Because I can appreciate, and it's like divorce. In a best case scenario, you don't want to see couples divorce. And in a best case scenario, you don't want to see a country break up. So, I mean, I understand the argument on both sides. And for me, that's not a do or die kind of issue. But back to, when you said, Roland, about voting patterns in the church, I will say this, though. Years ago, you could be a Christian and you could vote Liberal or NDP or Conservative, and it didn't matter. I'm sorry to say those days are over. The federal Liberal and the federal NDP have essentially banned Christians from running from those parties. You have to support the
Not just the federal NDP, I think the provincial as well.
Provincial as well. I'm just sort of speaking mostly at the federal level, but you can't, you have to support abortion and homosexuality and transgenderism and MAID and all these things that are unbiblical. Christians can't support these things. And so what the Liberals and the NDP have done, again, speaking at the federal level, have banned Christians from running, banned, people with biblical morality from running. So, and I'm not saying the Conservative Party is the end-all be-all, but at least Christians are allowed to run for the Conservative Party. You have Christians in the Conservative Party who are doing good work. Arnold Viersen, Andrew Lawton, and others that are doing good work. So I think as a Christian, you could maybe vote for the Conservatives. You may vote for the Christian Heritage Party. You could maybe cast your vote for the People's Party. I don't believe there's any place. How can Christians vote for a party that bans Christians from running for it? It's not the church that has created those divisions. It's the parties. There used to be a pro-life caucus in Ottawa, on Parliament Hill, that included members of Parliament from all the parties. And now there are only Conservatives there because the Liberals and the NDP have banned Christians and people with those moral positions from running. So, I mean, I would argue that in the church there is no place for people who vote Liberal and NDP because those are Antichrist parties who have banned Christians. And so I don't understand in good conscience how Christians could be a part of that.
Well, and we want to be very clear because, we don't want to sit here and say you have to vote Conservative, you have to vote this way.
We don't want to be partisan.
But we also have to recognize that the policies of the parties, that's who we're voting for. We cannot put our faith in any specific party or any specific person. We live in a fallen, broken world. And to acknowledge that it's the policies that we have to vote for, not the people, because the people are easily corrupted. We've seen it so many times with politicians.
And they're replaced.
They run on our values and their people, and then they get in there and I don't know if they drink a Kool-Aid or something, but they seem to just turn on us. So we have to be very clear that we run on policies and our loyalty is to God, not to man. Would you agree with that?
Well, absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Did you want to talk on that? What did we actually talk?
It's Roland's turn now.
Yeah.
Just going back to the original prompt, which was, I believe, what was the original prompt
You know
again?
what? I was hoping you remember because I forgot. We've gone down too many rabbit holes since
Anyway,
then.
I'll just build on what's being said. The difficult part about this too is if you look at the church and you look at the membership, churches are full of hypocrites, and I know because I'm in there too.
Yeah.
And that's why I always joke about when people say, well, I don't go to church because it's full of hypocrites. And oh, yes, no problem. There's room for another one. Yeah. Right? You know, because I've never met someone who is so wonderfully morally upright and have never, you know, failed to live up to even their own standards, let alone a standard given externally, such as we find in the scriptures as what we're held to be a standard. I certainly fail that on a daily basis, and you can only ask the people around me, and they'll show you how I failed. God bless them. And so the thing that I wonder though too is, how do you accomplish a transformation of society? Do you do it politically? Is it a cultural question? Is it a religious question? Because I'm not convinced that the election of one party over another is going to ultimately fix the fundamental issue. And in a sense, democracies get exactly what they deserve because the voting population has chosen this, right? And so in so many ways, I see the more effective thing to do is not squabble over politics and parties. Not that these things aren't important, but the church's focus should be on sharing the gospel message, discipling. And I believe in doing those things, you know, one by one, it snowballs, and all of a sudden you see change at a more societal level, right? I don't think people are going to accomplish what they hope to accomplish using the coercive power of the state. Christianity has always flourished when it's invitational, in my view. And the one thing that's interesting about, you know, earlier we're talking about Christians fleeing persecution. And throughout history, many Christians have fled persecution. Absolutely, rightly so, understandably so. But there have also been Christians that have called to stay.
Yeah. Called
to be martyred if necessary. And to me, that connects to the doctrine of vocation. In the event things change drastically here and things become very, very, very bad for pastors and Christians or whatnot, let's just assume as a hypothetical. Does that mean we run? Maybe. Maybe some people are called to run. Maybe some people are called to witness. Maybe some people are called to remain at their post and continue to serve the people that God has called unto himself in this country. And so I think this is where things become very complicated. And, you know, I think about this because I've read the biographies of a lot of people that suffered under communism.
Yeah.
Or even Nazism or Maoist, you know, China or whatever.
Any sort of dictatorship.
Any sort of dictatorship of any stripe.
Yeah.
And they say again that, you know, they felt compelled to stay. Bonhoeffer had the chance to stay in America. Mm-hmm. But he felt compelled he needed to go back to his people, his homeland, to serve them and serve the church. He could have had a nice, comfy career at Harvard and Princeton. He could have been perfectly, wonderfully comfortable and lived out a nice life, but he was called into great suffering and ultimately execution at the hand of an unjust and wicked government in the form of Nazi Germany. And so regardless of what happens here, I think churches need to be focusing on that discipleship, and we need to be focusing on the fact that as Jesus promised us, regardless of how righteous a society might or might not be, we're going to be persecuted.
I think that's important. I mean, I'm not comparing the Nazis to the Canadian government, but I mean, we do have to realize that we're at a time and each of us are put here for this specific time. But I think that goes back to a lot of Christians don't actually understand what's going on in the world. They don't understand history. And we have a younger generation who does not know how to have a conversation, right? So I don't know the age demographic of a number of your churches, but how do you deal with conversations when people just feel as soon as you disagree with me, you're arguing with me or you hate me? And that inability to debate, that seems to have been lost in societies in general. Do you come across that in your church?
I don't have a lot of youth in my church. My church is fairly older demographically, and it's an older part of town.
There's that don't know how to
yeah,
debate either.
No, certainly. When I come across somebody, like a lot of time, I don't generally argue with people over politics, even in the church. I don't argue with them, I discuss it with them. But even then, some, not all, the very idea that I would disagree, for example, on separation, you know, one way or the other, would send some people into a tailspin because they have never been challenged in that way, probably right from when they were young. And saying you're not always right, and just because you feel a certain way does not mean you need to act on it. Right?
Absolutely.
And that is not the message that they're getting from higher education or even lower education these days, right?
Education in general.
Education in general.
Your feelings
it's government
matter.
run. Yes, your feelings are tantamount. And so to have somebody push back on you from that point of view is almost to just, it's a pointless argument. I don't know how you get through that.
Okay.
I honestly don't know, and I've never been successful at doing it, so.
All right, Patrick, I happen to know you are fairly opinionated on some things. How do you deal with that?
Well, you know, in our church, I think we have to separate, you know, sort of the essential issues from the non-essential issues. Like even, for example, Alberta Separation. You know, in our church, we've had people, you know, even collecting signatures on the petition in our foyer before the service, you know, doing things like that. And other people, you know, don't support that. And I see something like Alberta Separation is one of those non-essential issues that we can discuss and debate and hold different viewpoints on. And I think we do a good job at that. But in our church too, I think we understand that there are some issues that there really is no compromise on. And we refer to some of those things. For abortion, you know, the slaughter of the unborn in the womb. And, you know, so often we hear in the world that, you know, diversity is our strength, you know, the governments and talking about countries and churches. And we used to be a part of a denomination that was, you know, diversity is our strength. I found that diversity is not our primary strength in the church. It's unity. Unity is the strength. And I think too in a church, if you have a church where there are disagreements over homosexuality, over abortion, over some of these issues that I think are both political and moral, that's going to tear your church apart. And we've seen that happen in the previous denomination that we were with, the Canadian Baptists. Huge debate over the LGBTQ issue, which is very divisive. You had churches on both sides leaving, and let's face it, that's been an issue in the Lutheran denominations as well too. And so if you don't have unity on those core issues, you're going to have all kinds of division. And so I think in the church, again, it's about separating. You know, we can have maybe different views on, you know, eschatology. We can have different views on predestination. And I'm sure my brothers here would agree with that. But when it comes to the deity of Christ, is there room for different views in the church? I don't think there is.
No, there's
you know,
not.
again, so we have to understand we can debate those things that are non-essentials, but there must be unity in those things that are essentials.
Absolutely. All right, Roland, we've got about a minute left. Do you want to close us out with a...
Sure. And the thing that I would just say is, in this age, we need to have hard conversations. We need to have grace for each other, mercy for each other, love for each other. We need to recognize that there's actually something more important than our politics. As I read in a devotional recently, we tend to do politics without ceasing as Christians as opposed to prayer without ceasing. And perhaps we should return to the fundamentals again. And the last thing that I would say in terms of talking to people who might not be able to have those conversations, never underestimate the power of story. And this is something that I think Jordan Peterson got very right, regardless of how anyone feels about him, and what many other people have been picking up that have been able to really speak to the younger generation. They've done it not through facts and logic Ben Shapiro way, they've done it through story. And that's been very, very, very powerful. And humans are built for story because we're part of a grand narrative. And Christ is the center of that story. And I think if we can explain the story, if we can share the story and help contextualize people in that story, that's when you see transformation.
Absolutely. And with that, I'd like to thank you for joining us for this roundtable, and we'll see you again.